out on the edge of a small town. Hannah thought it was just her old rescue dog, and a quiet stretch of field. Then a wild mother bobcat, heavy with babies, began pacing her fence and fixating on the dangerous road below. One stormy evening, when lightning rolled over the ridge and tires screamed on wet asphalt, the choice to trust that wild mother and the dog at Hannah's side would change everything. The day the unease started, the air over Pine Hollow felt a little too still. Late August light lay flat over the dry pasture behind my house, painting everything in pale gold. Yet something in it felt watchful, as if the field itself were holding its breath. I paused on the back step, coffee cooling in my hand, listening for a sound I couldn't name. Nothing moved, but I had the odd sense that something out there was choosing not to. That night, a faint scrape woke me, the kind that slips into a dream and then won't leave. I lay in the dark, counting the hum of the old fridge, the soft tick of the baseboard heater, the distant truck on the highway. Under it all, there it was again, a gentle drag across the siding near the bedroom window. By the time I sat up, the sound was gone, leaving my heart beating harder than the noise deserved. In the morning, my work boots weren't where I had left them. Yesterday, they had waited by the mudroom bench, toes neatly pointed toward the door. Now one lay tipped on its side, scuffed, a thin line of pale dust around the heel where it had clearly been nudged. Ranger lifted his nose to it, then to the back door, ears pricked, before settling again with a huff that sounded almost disapproving. Out by the fence, the dry grass held a darker trail, a narrow path pressed low where something heavier than a rabbit had passed. I followed it with my eyes to the break in the sage at the property line, where the wild ground began its slow climb toward the ridge. A faint musk hung there, sharp and foreign, just noticeable beneath the dust and sun-warmed wood. The hairs on my arms lifted as if I had stepped into a draft. At the rehab center in town, I tried to shake it off. Paperwork waited, and the chorus of patients needed feeding. Injured hawks, a one-winged crow, a raccoon with more attitude than sense. Still, twice I caught myself glancing toward the back door, certain it'd hear that same dragging sound on the threshold. Each time it was only the wind, teasing the metal latch, making me feel foolish for jumping at ordinary noise. When I came home after sunset, the porch light carved a small circle out of the dark. The gravel drive glimmered, undisturbed, yet the old welcome rug was puckered into a hollow, as if something had curled on it and then slipped away. Ranger went straight to the rug, nose working, tail lifted in a slow, uncertain sweep. He stared out toward the pasture, not barking, just listening. I found myself doing the same. The third night, a soft thud pressed through the wall behind my headboard, followed by a low, almost questioning sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl. It carried through the studs like a hand pressed briefly to my shoulder. I held my breath, listening to my own pulse for a full minute before common sense marched in. Probably a branch, I told myself, or a raccoon trying the gutters. Country houses make strange noises. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The town was quiet. The highway a faraway whisper. Yet the space around the house felt occupied in a way I couldn't name. I lay there, watching the dim rectangle of the window, feeling as if someone was on watch just beyond the glass. There was no real reason for my nerves to climb, no threat I could point to, only that steady, unreasonable certainty. I was not the only one paying attention here. By the end of the week, a pattern had settled in. Every morning, something small but definite had shifted around the house. A porch chair nudged half a foot. Claw marks no bigger than pencil lines on the post. The same neat indent on the rug outside the door. Ranger began sleeping with his nose aimed at the back window, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't catch. It was like living with a partner who kept getting up to check on a crying baby I never heard. The first real glimpse came just after dawn, when the pasture still wore its thin veil of mist. I stepped out with a bucket of seed for the songbirds and saw Ranger freeze halfway down the steps. One paw lifted. There, at the far fence line, a low shape moved along the posts, shoulders rolling in a determined, practiced way. Tawny, tufted, larger than any barn visitor I was used to. It did not hurry when I opened the door wider. It simply flowed into the sage and vanished. I told myself it was just a transient predator passing through, the kind that skirted ranches at night and left nervous chickens in its wake. You've rehabbed worse, I muttered while measuring out medication for a grumpy fox later that morning. Still, when Sheriff Luke stopped by the centre for his usual coffee, I heard my voice soften with something like confession as I asked if anyone had reported losing goats or outdoor dogs up near Pine Hollow. Luke's eyes sharpened in that quiet way he had brought back from deployments. Tracks? He asked. I described what he'd seen at the fence. The moved boots. The scuffed porch. He listened without teasing, without the easy jokes we usually traded. Could just be passing through, he said at last. But his gaze flicked to the map on the wall, to the pale line of the highway near my road. Long as it stays cautious of people, that's fine. That evening, the shape waited longer. I found Ranger pressed to the sliding door, breath fogging the glass, tail held level. Outside, in the slanting light. The visitor paced just beyond the garden beds, not quite approaching, not quite fleeing. Wide paws, short tail, thick fur along the cheekbones that caught the sun. Her eyes skipped over the dog and settled on me with a steadiness that made my throat go dry. Then she tipped her head toward the ridge, as if checking something behind her, and moved off. I locked the door out of habit, then stood there with my hand still on the latch. Just a wild neighbour, I told Ranger, who did not look convinced. The rehab centre had policies about habituation. We kept our distance, even from patients who charmed us. Yet something in that look had not felt like random curiosity. It had felt like recognition or expectation, the way an anxious client watches a doctor's face before any words are said. Over the next days, I began noticing the timing. She appeared around the same windows of the day, just after dawn, just before dusk, always skirting the edge of the property, rarely crossing the line of the closest fence post. Once I found a fresh rabbit laid out at the edge of the mown yard, untouched, its body pointed toward the house. A gift, or a warning, I couldn't decide which unsettled me more. One evening, as thunderheads stacked over the ridge, I watched her pause near the gravel road that ran past my drive, staring at the blind corner where tourists sometimes flew by too fast. Her body was tense, every line hard as wire. Cars passed. She flattened herself, waited, then resumed her pacing. I realized she wasn't simply hunting. She was watching the road, and by extension, the town that lay beyond it. I went to bed with that image in my head, the wild watcher at the edge of the human world. What was she waiting for? What invisible map was she tracing? Day after day, along my fence and that dangerous stretch of asphalt. The question lodged beside my ribs, a small, persistent ache, as if my own life had been nudged half an inch off centre and had yet to settle again. Long before she began pacing my fence line, the ridge had been her only sure thing. Winters came lean in these hills, pinching the creek down to a silent vein of ice and sending deer farther out into the ranch pastures. She learned each dip and hollow where snow piled last, each windbreak where a shredded juniper might hide a mouse tunnel. Hunger taught her to gamble, edging nearer the faint smell of cattle and diesel than her kind usually dared. The first time a steel trap snapped near her, air and pain vanished together. The world shrank to the white-hot clamp on her forepaw and the taste of iron in her mouth, body flinging and twisting against the chain until exhaustion finally pinned her. She lay there, heart hammering, all instincts screaming to rip and tear. But a quieter, older instinct said, stillness might yet mean survival. When the rancher found her, he swore under his breath at the sight of her swollen belly, then did something she had not expected. He pried the springs apart and let her go. She ran until her lungs burned, until the trap scent fell behind. For weeks after, she limped, leaving a staggered pattern in the snow. That scar taught her things. Some humans hurt without thinking. Some hurt by design, and a rare few changed their minds halfway through the act. She carved paths that skirted houses wider than before, avoiding dogs whose voices cracked bright and sharp through the air. She learned the sound of a gun being uncased from inside a truck before the door even opened. In spring, when the high grass returned and the creek spoke again, she tried raising her first litter closer to the ridge, far from people. The den washed out twice, once in a sudden storm that sent mud slumping like wet bread dough across the entrance, and once in a slide of loose rock. She lost one kit to cold and another to a quiet, unexplained fading that no amount of grooming could reverse. By summer, only a single youngster tumbled at her heels, the one who learned quickest to freeze at her hiss. They hunted the edges of the ranches that year, staying downwind of barns and porch lights, cutting between hay bales like ghosts. Once, a pair of boys on bicycles spotted the youngster standing bold in a track and threw rocks until she bolted. The bruises healed, but the memory did not. From then on, the mother kept any future dens closer to cover. Yet she never forgot the way that gravel had felt under her pads, or how fast the wrong kind of human could close the distance with nothing more than curiosity and boredom. When her first surviving kit finally slipped away to claim its own range, the quiet left behind echoed louder than she liked. The ridge was generous but hard, unforgiving of hesitation. Coyotes pressed in as more houses rose at the valley edge. A new highway exit brought fresh noise, fresh smells, and careless traffic near the very creek she had always used as a safe path. She watched from the brush as headlights streaked by, the roar of engines flattening the night. Around that time, she scented him for the first time, the male who would become her shadow and shield. He moved with the same cautious boldness she had been forced to learn, his trail weaving between old danger and new. Their first meetings were wary, short, circled by mutual appraisal. It took the better part of a season before she allowed him near enough to share a kill. Another before she let him close to any den. Trust, for her, was no longer a reflex. It was a slow, deliberate decision. Years passed in the steady grind of surviving. She crossed paths with more people than she liked. Hikers looked through her as if she were scenery. A hunter once took aim and then, for reasons she would never know, lowered his rifle to wipe his face instead. The ranch traplines shifted, following cattle to new leased fields. All of it forced her to redraw her routes, moving her hunting closer and closer to the cluster of lights that was town. Each revision carried a cost, measured in lost cover, new sounds, and the rising thrum of human lives. As her joints began to complain in winter and her breath came harsher after a sprint, another change took shape inside her. The new litter felt heavier, each movement a reminder of both promise and risk. The old den sites no longer seemed safe. The ridge no longer distant enough from the roar of the highway. That was when she began circling my house, the small square of warm light at the edge of wild ground, weighing it as if it were another kind of shelter. She knew, on some instinct deeper than language, that humans could cage and cut. She had smelled antiseptic drifting from the rehab centre truck when it rattled past on the county road, had watched injured hawks return to the sky with strange bands on their legs. Help and harm wore the same scent. So when she started pacing my fence at dawn and dusk, she did it with every muscle ready to flee, yet with a thin, stubborn hope pushing her feet forward anyway. The first clear signal came on a Tuesday, the kind of day that started with a dropped coffee mug and a stack of intake forms taller than it should be. I was late getting home, the sky already bruising toward twilight as I turned off the highway. A sedan shot past, taking the corner near my drive too fast, tyres spitting gravel toward the ditch. I muttered a word my mother wouldn't have liked and eased into my lane, grateful no deer had tried crossing at that moment. Halfway up my drive, Ranger went rigid in the back seat, a low growl curling out of him like smoke. I followed his gaze and saw her standing in the open, closer to the house than she had ever dared, body planted between the gravel road and my yard. She didn't flinch from the car. Instead, she stared straight at my headlights, then deliberately shifted her focus to the blind corner where the sedan had just disappeared, as if pointing. I parked slowly, not wanting to spook either of them. When I stepped out, she didn't bolt. Her mate hovered near the brush, muscles coiled, but she held her ground. Ranger stayed at my heel, vibrating with the urge to rush forward, yet somehow restraining himself to small, careful steps. The two of them met eyes for a long moment, some comparison of rank passing silently between them, before she shifted her weight and limped just slightly toward the corner again. That was when I noticed the stiffness in her gait, the way her sides rounded more than they had last week. Pregnant, I realized, and far enough along that each breath seemed to lift her ribs with effort. The sight tugged at an old part of me, the one that had spent years in an emergency room watching mothers come in scared and exhausted, hoping for hands that knew what they were doing. You picked a fine place to hover. Sweetheart, I murmured, surprising myself with the endearment. Over the next days, her signals grew more insistent. I would step out with the trash and find her already stationed near the ditch, eyes flicking between me and the road. If a truck or RV roared past above the suggested speed limit, she tensed, tail twitching in agitation until the noise faded. Once, she even paced right up to the mailbox post and clawed a jagged slash into it, then stared at me with an expression that felt uncomfortably close to accusation. I started mentioning it to Luke in more than passing terms. "She's fixated on that corner," I told him over diner coffee, tracing a circle on the laminated menu where my road met the county highway, almost like she's guarding it, or expecting something bad to happen there. He listened, tapping his thumb once, twice, against his cup, or remembering something that already did. He said quietly, "Animals mark trauma, same as people." The following week, a tourist in a rental SUV slammed on his brakes too late and skidded into the ditch just beyond my drive, coming within a breath of rolling. No one was hurt. The tow truck hauled him out while he complained loudly about poor signage. But when I walked back up my lane, there she was again, perched on a low-rise nearby, ears pinned, eyes locked on the churned-up dirt where the tires had chewed in. She didn't look startled. She looked vindicated. That night, as thunder flickered far off over the plains, I found myself standing at the window longer than usual. She moved in and out of the porch light's reach, a darker shadow along the grass, circling the house in a slow, purposeful track. On her third loop, she paused by the back door, placing one wide paw directly on the hollow she had made so many nights in the rug. Then, for the first time, she looked up, right into my face, and did not look away. Something in me clicked then, the way a puzzle piece slides into place after sitting on the table for days. She wasn't just visiting. She was asking me to pay attention to that corner, to the speed, to the thin line between her world and mine, where metal and fur could collide too easily. I didn't know yet what she wanted me to do about it. But for the first time, our uneasy coexistence shifted into the faint outline of a shared problem. When I finally turned off the lights and headed down the hallway, Ranger padded at my side, nails ticking on the hardwood. Halfway to the bedroom, he paused, glanced back toward the yard, and gave a quiet, thoughtful woof. It sounded less like a warning and more like agreement, as if he, too, had received some message in those circling steps and steady, golden eyes. September arrived dry and crackling, the fields bleached and brittle under a sky that forgot how to rain. Dust hung in every ray of light, and the creek below the ridge shrank to a series of shallow, reluctant pools. The town filled with late-season tourists chasing one more hike before snow. With them came trailers, roof racks, and a new kind of carelessness on the highway near my place. The county had been slow to add better signage around the blind corner. Luke pushed, but budgets were tight and the list was long. So instead, he started parking his cruiser in the shallow pullout by my driveway whenever he could. A quiet presence that nudged people's feet off the gas. From my kitchen window, I watched him sip coffee and watch the road, his gaze flicking now and then toward the hills where our wild neighbour moved like a rumour between shadows. She, in turn, watched him more than once. I saw her lingering near the pasture fence while he sat in the cruiser, her body angled toward the road, yet her eyes tracking the white car and its still occupant. Ranger would lie on the porch like an old soul, tail sweeping once whenever her mate appeared on the ridge behind her. A silent escort. The four of us formed a strange, loose square of attention around that strip of asphalt, each aware of the others in our own way. Then came the day the conflict broke out into the open. A lifted pickup barreled down the highway well above the posted limit, bass rattling its windows. It took the corner too wide, clipping the gravel lip of my drive and sending a spray of stones into the pasture. The pickup swerved back into its lane, horn blaring as it nearly sideswiped an oncoming sedan. Brakes squealed. Dust boiled up, and somewhere deep in my chest, the old ER dread lit like a match. Before I could reach the porch, the pickup had jerked to a halt in the pullout, driver's door flying open. A man in his 30s jumped down, sunburned and impatient, already cursing about stupid animals and idiot drivers in the same breath. He stalked toward the ditch, where, to my horror, she now stood in full view, having rushed closer at the sound of squealing tires. Her body was low, ears flat, torn between the road and the man bearing down. Ranger beat me to the edge of the yard, hackles up, a warning bark ripping out of him. The man barely glanced at the dog. "Shoo," he snapped, striding closer to the wild mother, who held her ground a moment too long. "Get out of here." He raised his leg, not yet a full kick, but the clear beginning of one. The same careless motion kids used on strays that annoyed them. Time stretched into a thin wire. My voice stuck behind my teeth. Luke moved faster than either of us. I hadn't even seen his cruiser pull in. But suddenly he was there. One hand on the man's shoulder, the other lifted in a calm, firm barrier. "That's close enough," he said, voice low but carrying. The man jerked, more startled than ashamed. "You can't just let some wild thing run around by the road," he snapped. It almost got me killed. She was here before the asphalt. Luke replied, positioning himself so his body and the badge on his chest were squarely between the man and the animal. And you're the one doing 70 in a 45. His tone stayed level, but the old steel was there, the kind that had walked him through places far darker than this dusty pullout. The man hesitated, weighing whether the argument was worth it, then flung up his hands and stalked back to his truck. Through it all, she did not bolt. She watched the raised boot, the blocking arm, the subtle shift in power when one male stepped in front of the other. When the pickup roared away, she turned her gaze on Luke for a long beat, then on me, standing frozen near the porch steps. Only when Ranger gave a low, appeasing whine did she back away into the grass, her mate appearing behind her like a silent shadow to guide her back toward the ridge. That night, the air felt charged, as if the argument still hung over the property like static before lightning. I couldn't shake the image of that half-formed kick and the way my own lungs had forgotten how to work for a second. I had seen enough bruised ribs and cracked jaws in the ER to know how quickly a thoughtless swing could turn into something worse. The idea of anyone doing that to her, heavy with the weight she carried, made my chest ache. In the days that followed, her behaviour shifted. She paced less along the distant fence and more near the house itself, often pausing where the gravel met the pasture, gazing from the corner to my front door as if measuring the distance. She seemed restless, distracted, sometimes stopping mid-step to press her nose to her own side. Ranger mirrored her unease, pacing the house at night, nosing my hand awake more than once with a soft, insistent whimper. One hot afternoon, I found a faint smear of dried blood on the porch rail, too high for any raccoon. Panic flared, sharp and sour. I followed the trail with my eyes toward the field, where the grass rippled in a breeze that hadn't existed a moment before. Somewhere in that golden sea, something was happening that I didn't yet understand. The decision I had been avoiding, whether to truly intervene in her life or keep pretending I was only an observer, pressed in from all sides, demanding an answer. The call came from a neighbour just after 5, while the light outside still held that tender, forgiving quality that makes every floor look softer. "Hannah, something's wrong in your lower field, Mrs. Carter said, breathless. I saw a big, wild thing go down by the brush, and it hasn't gotten up. Your dog's down there, too, running circles like his tail's on fire." I hung up, grabbed the field kit I kept by the back door, and whistled. Ranger was already at the gate before the sound finished leaving my mouth, eyes blazing with an urgency he'd only seen on disaster deployments. He shot ahead of me as soon as the latch clicked, nose glued to the dry earth, following a scent line so strong It seemed to pull his shoulders forward. I jogged after him, heart stumbling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with age. She lay half in, half out of the shade of a scrubby bush, sides heaving. The dry ground under her scraped raw from her efforts. Her eyes were half closed, mouth parted in a grimace that was all struggle and no sound. The swelling of her belly, so prominent these past weeks, now looked wrong hard in places, slack in others. Her mate hovered a few yards back, pacing in a short, tight loop that carved dust into the air, torn between fleeing and staying. I dropped to my knees beside her, the old training sliding into place even as my mind screamed that this was not a hospital bed, not a human chart. Heat radiated off her body, the air around her thick with the copper tang of blood and the sour edge of prolonged labour. Easy. Mama, I murmured, more for myself than for her, slipping on gloves with fingers that wanted to shake. Let me see what's happening. That was when Ranger did the thing that changed everything. Instead of circling anxiously or barking at the hovering male, he came to a sharp, controlled stop on the opposite side of her body, head lowered. Slowly, deliberately, he extended one paw and placed it a few inches from a particular spot on her abdomen. Then he leaned in, nose almost touching that place, inhaling deeply, eyes flicking up to mine with a clear, urgent question. I frowned, reaching to palpate where he indicated. Under my fingers, I felt the firm curve of a kit positioned wrong, lodged in a way that blocked the rest of the delivery. A breach, and one that had been stuck long enough to threaten both mother and young. The textbooks from my ER days didn't cover this exact scenario, but the principles were the same. Relief of obstruction, support of the exhausted body, calm in the face of panic. Good boy, I said hoarsely. You're right. That's the problem. The field around us seemed to hold its breath as I worked. With Luke's help, he had arrived silently, breathless from running down from his cruiser at the road. We improvised a sterile pad beneath her, used the portable oxygen in my kit to buy her lungs a little mercy, and coaxed that stubborn kit into a safer position. Her mate hovered at the edge of every move, muscles bunched, but Ranger kept himself between the male's teeth and my hands, a living barrier of trust. Halfway through, shouts drifted down from the road. The pickup from days before had returned, its driver rubbernecking at the sight of the cruiser and the figures in the field. You've gotta be kidding me, he called, incredulous laughter in his voice. You stopped traffic for a wild cat. Gravel crunched as he tromped closer, ignoring Luke's earlier warnings as if time and heat had erased them. I heard his footsteps pounding through the dry grass just as I felt the kit finally slide free beneath my hands. The mother sagged, spent, while a faint, wet, squirming sound told me at least one new life had made it into the sun. Then a shadow fell across us, and the same voice scoffed near my shoulder. If it's that much trouble, maybe it'd be kinder to put it down. Here, let me. The man's boot lifted, the beginning of that thoughtless, entitled motion again, aimed not quite at her, not quite at the wriggling bundle, but at the fragile space between them. Before he could bring it down, Luke moved. All the years between combat and small-town patrol collapsing into a single, decisive streak. He stepped in, catching the man's leg mid-swing with one hand and shoving his centre of gravity just enough that he stumbled backward, sprawling in the dust with a shocked curse. "Back off," Luke said, voice quiet but edged with something that cut deeper than a shout. He planted himself between the sprawled man and our small, desperate tableau, one hand held out in a non-negotiable stop. Ranger mirrored him, teeth just visible, body coiled but controlled. The message was wordless and unmistakable. This line is not yours to cross. For a moment, all the human noise dropped away. The mother raised her head, eyes slitting open to study the man on the ground. Then the two figures standing guard, the SCAL turned sheriff and the rescue dog who had found the fault line in her body. Her gaze slid to me, to my gloved hands cradling the damp, squirming newborn. In that shared silence, something settled between all of us, a recognition that this birth, this risk, had bound our fates together more tightly than any of us had planned. The man muttered something about crazy animal people and retreated at the hard set of Luke's jaw, kicking dirt instead of flesh this time. His pickup roared away, its sound shrinking into the distance. The crisis around the road, the kicks, the badge, all of it receded to a dull throb at the edges of my awareness as the mother nudged her kit weakly, then strained again. Another contraction, another life, this one arriving more easily now that the blockage was gone. By the time the sun slid lower, painting the field in rich amber, two small shapes nestled against her flank, breathing in that shivery, astonished way of the newly born. Her mate finally crept closer, touching his nose gently to her shoulder, then to each kit in turn. Ranger, spent but still watchful, lowered himself to the ground opposite them, paws stretched out, head on his forelegs like an old sentinel. I sat back on my heels, sweat cooling on my neck, and felt the knot in my chest let go at last. In the weeks that followed, the field where she had laboured took on a different weight. It was no longer just a stretch of dry grass and disturbed soil. It was a threshold we all crossed together now. She moved more slowly for a time, but each day her stride grew surer as the kits found their legs, stumbling after her in crooked lines that straightened by the week. From the porch, I watched their silhouettes against the setting sun, a small procession tracing routes she had once walked alone. Ranger adopted a new schedule as if it had been written into his bones. At dawn and dusk, he insisted on patrols along the fence, trotting with a purposeful air that made neighbours smile when they drove by. Sometimes he and the wild family moved in parallel, separated by a few yards and a thin wire of fence, each respecting the other's space. When the kits bounced too near, he would give a soft, chuffing woof, more an uncle's reminder than a warning, and they would dart back to their mother's side. Luke made sure the human world kept up its end of the bargain. Speed traps appeared more often near my corner. So did new signs, warning of wildlife crossings. The story of the crazy sheriff who blocked a kick to save a wild mama made the rounds at the diner, losing and gaining details in equal measure. I heard younger men laugh at it, older ones nod, and more than a few women glance toward the window where the highway glimmered and say, "Good." The rehab centre, too, shifted in small ways. I found myself talking about her when school groups visited, using her story to explain why habitat mattered, why roads were more than convenience for us. Children pressed their hands to the big map on the wall, tracing the ridgeline where she lived. A few asked, in earnest, whether the wild mother understood that we had tried to help. "I think she understands enough," I answered, thinking of the way her gaze now lingered on the house with something close to ease. Our evenings took on a ritual. After dinner, I'd carry a mug of tea out to the porch swing while Ranger settled at my feet. The sky would soften, the first stars trembling to life overhead. Soon enough, shapes would appear near the field. The rounded form of the mother, the leaner outline of her mate, and the smaller, wobbly figures of the kits testing their bravery at the edge of shadow. We existed in a kind of shared quiet, 3 species breathing the same cooling air without demanding more than that. Now and then, trouble still brushed close. A new driver would barrel around the corner too fast, earning a firm talking to from Luke and a disapproving stare from me. Once, the kits strayed closer than I liked to the ditch and froze there as headlights swept by. But their mother's sharp hiss sent them scrambling back before danger could close its fist. Each near miss carved the lesson deeper into all of us. Vigilance was not a phase, but a way of life out here. On the first chilly night of October, I stood at the field's edge with a blanket around my shoulders and watched her settle on the very spot where she had collapsed weeks earlier. The ground still bore faint scars from our hurried work. The soil packed a little harder, the grass growing back in uneven patches. The kits climbed over her, batting at her ears, before finally curling against her like commas, Ranger lay a polite distance away, eyes half-lidded, as if standing one more quiet watch before winter. By the time the first snow came thin and hesitant over Pine Hollow, the kits had lost their baby clumsiness. They moved with sleek, assured grace along the fence line, their coats thickening against the cold. The mother carried herself differently, too still alert, still scarred by old traps and scares, yet marked now by a kind of settled strength. She had survived another hard season, and this time she hadn't done it alone. Inside the house, small reminders of that long, golden evening in the field gathered quietly. My gloves, cleaned but faintly stained, hung by the back door, the leather creased where my hands had gripped new life. The compact field kit, restocked and zipped tight, lived in a place of honour on the mudroom shelf instead of buried in the truck. On the fridge, a photo Luke had snapped with his battered phone showed Ranger lying in the grass, eyes soft, while 3 shadows, 2 small, one larger, blurred at the edge of the frame. Neighbours began referring to your wild family when they saw tracks near their properties, a joke laced with a hint of shared pride. Schoolchildren waved at the ridgeline when their buses passed, as if expecting the mother to wave back. At the diner, the story of the seal who stepped between a kick and a wild birth settled into local legend, described with a little more drama each time. Luke only rolled his eyes and changed the subject, but I caught him watching the road afterward with an even steadier gaze. As for me, the restlessness that had haunted my evenings before all this, the quiet ache of an empty house after my own son left for college, the hollow that grief had carved and time had only half filled, shifted into something gentler. I still had losses. That didn't change. But now, when the day's work was done and the town lights glowed faint in the distance, I had a small, wild checkpoint out in the dark, a place where eyes met across species, where trust had taken the risk of crossing a field. On the last night before winter truly closed its fist around the valley, I stood at the edge of the yard, breath puffing white, while Ranger leaned warmly against my leg. Across the field, she lifted her head from where she lay, curled with her mate and nearly grown kits. For a long moment, we regarded each other, 2 mothers who had laboured through different kinds of pain on the same dry earth. Then she dipped her head once, slow and deliberate, before settling again. I turned back toward the house, the porch light spilling a soft path across the frost-silvered grass. Behind me, the field rustled with quiet life. Ahead of me, the windows glowed with human warmth. Between those worlds, I no longer felt quite so alone. I had a watchful dog, a stubborn brother, and a wild family on the ridge who had chosen, in their way, to trust me. It wasn't the life I had planned, But as I closed the door on the cold, I knew with a steadiness that reached all the way to my bones, I was home, and so were they. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.